3, 2, 1. Boom.
Blast off, monsters. Hello and welcome to Zombies, Werewolves, and Vampires. Oh my, a panel in which we are going to talk about monsters and how you can use monsters in your writing. Particularly with me, it's going to be comics, but in general, any questions you have about horror and monsters, we are here to field them. I'm going to let my lovely panel of panelists introduce themselves, starting all the way back there. Professor, take us away.
Hi there, my name is David Bowles. I'm a Mexican-American author, translator, screenwriter, comic book writer. I have about 16 books to my name and 5 more coming in next year. It's kind of crazy, 2 of which are graphic novels. I love to write horror, science fiction, dark fantasy for teens and adults, and so a lot of my titles center around those themes.
My name is Kevin Garcia. I am a high school teacher. I teach writing, and I've been teaching that for about 14 years now, so about as long as my students have been alive. I'm also a professional writer and a freelance writer. I've been a journalist for many years, and for the past 10 years, I've been freelance writing with Marvel Comics, where I am part of the official handbook of the Marvel Universe, which basically means I've been paid to read comics. And I can say officially that I am a professional comic book historian, so obviously that's where a lot of my view comes in. I also have a big fondness for Victorian sci-fi and horror, which I think everybody on this panel pretty much has, so that's going to have something we have in common as well.
Hello all, my name is Jamie Barr. I am the lead singer and upright bassist for the band Danger Cakes out of Austin. I'm also the executive director of Girls Rock Austin. We're a nonprofit for girls, trans, non-binary youth. It's a mentorship and music education / social justice organization. I'm really excited to talk a lot about all the wonderful monsters of horror. We have a lot of influence on what goes into our own art, and it's kind of fun to be able to throw things that scare people into the mix, even I say scare people, but sometimes you can give them a flip and a twist and make it fun in a new way that's not necessarily scary, but lighthearted and wonderful.
So that brings it back to me. I am Drew Edwards. I am the writer and creator of the long-running indie comic. It's been going around for 19 years. If it was a kid, it would be in college. Halloween Man, and its spin-off title, Lucy Chaplin Science Starlet. I am the winner of the 2018 Best in Austin Award for a comic creator from the Austin Chronicle. I am a film critic. I am a horror movie fanatic, and I am a member of the Castle of Horror podcast, of which Jamie and David also have appeared on many times. And Kevin is going to be taking part in a live movie review of The Ring versus The Grudge. Believe it or not, that is a real movie, tonight at 8 o'clock. And so you can experience the magic firsthand yourself. And
The rest of us call it Sadako versus Kayako, but that's all right. Well,
he's been designated the guy that can pronounce it correctly.
I appreciate the history of it. That doesn't mean I'm linguistically skilled.
I'm going to kind of do the same thing. I love monsters. Everybody on this panel has a different relationship with them. So what I would like to do is, again, start with the professor down there on the end, go down, and everybody talk about their personal relationship with monsters and why you love monsters.
Well, I mean, I'm almost 50, so when I was growing up in the 70s, there's the kinds of things you would see on TV, usually on the weekends and reruns and so forth. There are lots of, black and white monster films. The Godzilla films were being broadcast on U.S. TV in dub versions. I read a lot of comics that my dad had saved up, pulp magazines also that he had when in the 50s. So I read a lot of those, kind of pulpy Black Mask and Weird Tales and all that stuff. And I really got into strange comics. When I was I mean, in the midst of all this, I was reading a lot of science fiction and fantasy as well. But I really loved the Swamp Thing, in the late '70s and early '80s. I was drawn to like the darker, freakier things in pop culture, and a lot of that had to do with growing up in a Mexican American family. My grandmother Garza used to, when I was a little kid, tell me and all my cousins these terrifying stories. And those of you who are Latino in the room, you know exactly what I'm talking about. You know, you grew up with the stories of La Llorona, Las Lechuzas, La Mano Pachona, this like disembodied hand that crawls around and like grabs little kids and strangles them and stuff like that. So like monsters are just like deeply ingrained in the cultural DNA of my family. So it was really easy for me to latch onto that early on. And so, as time went on and I realized I wanted to be an author, and I became a teacher first and then was writing and trying to reach struggling readers in middle school classrooms by retelling these folk tales that my grandmother had told me, but like in short story form with updating things and giving characters names and so forth. I began to realize that there was something there. There was something there that I could take the culture that I had grown up with that wasn't really represented in the literature that these kids had in their textbooks or in the movies and TV shows that they were watching, and use it. And that's when I write about monsters, I draw from that. My zombies sometimes are like undead luchadores, or my vampires are like Mexican vampires, the Tlahuelpuchi, that have to like take their legs off and transform into winged creatures to fly to a house where a newborn infant lays in its crib so they can drink blood from it. So like all the really,
as happens.
Yeah, as one does when one is cursed. Yeah. So monsters like mean so much to me in a big like American pop culture kind of way, but also in something that's like really specific to my own family's culture.
I want to get into this whole conversation about that right now as well, because I have a lot of study that I've done with that. But my personal take with monsters has a lot to do with my love of this idea of these cultural mythologies that are created behind heroes and monsters and things that we latch onto, and I like looking at the lineage of like where characters came from and stuff. So like Dracula, for example, I've had a lot of people tell me that vampires they've been around for thousands of years, and actually not in the way people think of vampires. The idea of a vampire as an undead spirit that curses people have been around for thousands of years. The idea of this like super, suave European guy that seduces women and drinks blood and then goes back to his, coffin, that was not something that predates the 1800s. And in fact, it barely predates Dracula in that Bram Stoker really stole that off of Lord Boldroy? Byron. No, not Lord Byron. It was a friend of his. But anyway. Balladori, thank you. He's the one that...
if Jason Henderson were here, he would have like beaten us all for not remembering that.
It is not Lord Byron. Lord Byron gets credit for it a lot. He did not create that. But the point is, it's only from that time period. And in fact, what happens if Dracula goes out in the sun? That's right, nothing happens. Because vampires have no problem with sunlight. The only reason that became a thing was because the first vampire movie, they ran out of budget and they didn't know how to end the story. So the director says, let's just say the sun kills him. So because Nosferatu had the vampire burn up in the sun, all subsequent tellings of vampires have vampires die in the sun. Prior to that, vampires had no issue with sunlight. So a lot of times I love looking at this history of things that we think have been around forever and just where did they actually come from. And I want to come off an aside for a quick second and say that the one who's considered to be the mother of science fiction and horror is Mary Shelley, of course, with Frankenstein, which she created when she was 18 years old. So she created all of science fiction and horror when she was 18. What'd you do? In that book, I know, right? In that book, though, has one of my favorite lines, because the monster, of course, is not the drooling idiot that he is in the movies. He is very well-spoken. And when he is threatening Victor Frankenstein to do what he is asked, he says, "If you do not do what I ask, I will glut the maw of death with the blood of all your remaining friends." And I love that line. He will kill so many people that death itself will say, dude, I've had enough. I'm full. I've seriously had enough. And he will kill more. That is a lot of people to kill. And that is just such a well-written line. I just love it so much. And I'm sorry, I'm getting off on a rant here, but my point is, Victorian literature, there's so much great stuff there. Go and mine that.
My relationship to horror is something where I kind of considered myself to be a goth baby. When I was little, I grew up in a house next to one of the oldest cemeteries in the United States, and everyone always said it was haunted. I never saw anything personally, but I always had that kind of eerie fear of this cemetery, but I also loved the cemetery. It was the only place my parents would allow us to go play on our own. I know, weird, right?
That was about to say.
Yeah, the only place. So we would go ride our bikes, and my 4 sisters, and it was one of the only times I could actually be by myself, and I would be hanging out under a willow tree, singing lullabies to the baby graves. I know, told you, goth baby. Yeah. But I always had that fear that, like, what if zombies just suddenly rise from the grave? We are like prime A realty right here. You know, they're going to come right into our house. What am I going to do? And I had nightmares. I've had nightmares my whole life about zombies. That mob mentality, that fear that everyone is doing the same thing. Yeah. It's one of those things that I feel like has, just stayed with me as I've gotten older. And, I moved to Austin from upstate New York in 2009 and started my band, my current band, Danger Cakes. And, we're an all-girl band. We play with a lot of rockabilly and soul and psychobilly bands, and I had never really even knew the word psychobilly before. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with this term, it's basically a combination of horror and rockabilly music, but it's kind of usually, it's all different tempos, but has a theme of either monsters or murder and mayhem and things along those lines. But I didn't really feel like, doing something that was going to be too violent in this music. But I really enjoyed finding ways to take the things I am scared of and, like I say, making them almost whimsical. So with Danger Cakes, one of our first hits was My Boyfriend is a Zombie. It's a fun doo-wop song. And actually, Mr. Drew Edwards right here gets to sing as the voice of my zombie boyfriend on stage with us. And we've toured internationally, and people everywhere love this song.
Are you guys on Spotify?
We are on Spotify and
Yeah,
iTunes.
Danger Cakes.
and
Oh my God, you're gonna love them.
anywhere
They're
where you
great.
can find music. So yeah, Danger Cakes. But a little shameless self-promotion. But
Perfectly appropriate self-promotion.
yeah, it was one of those things. At first time.
Contextual
And it was also technically, and Drew also helped by writing the bridge of that song. And it was the first time I had written a song with someone else. So not only was it my first kind of jump into the horror music genre, but it was also my first time collaborating with someone. And that's also really important when you're creating anything, because no person is an island. And even when you think you're going to do everything and you're going to pull a Prince and play every instrument on every song that you wrote every single word to, and you produce it all, some people are still going to have to go into the making of it. And so I think that's a great way to create new relationships. And it all just started from, being scared in a cemetery, singing dead baby lullabies.
So, like Jamie, my relationship with the horror genre and monsters goes way back, and it's kind of a personal story for me. So I'm a twin, and I'm going to dig in a little deep here with that issue here in a second. But growing up, I'm a 80s kid. I grew up in the 80s, which was a boom time for the horror genre. We had a drive-in theater in my hometown. My parents took me to see all these great monster movies with practical effects, Ghostbusters, Godzilla 1985, all of the Friday the 13th movies. I loved monsters. At the same time, because of the explosion of video store culture, I was watching Universal movies, Hammer movies, all the Draculas, all the Frankensteins, the Creature from the Black Lagoon, Wolfman, old Godzilla films. I was enamored and hooked with monsters very early, even getting into comic books. My favorite superhero to this day is the Thing from the Fantastic Four, because he is a superhero that is also a monster. And it's just something that I deeply shared with my twin. We both loved monsters. We both loved Halloween. We were each other's best friends our whole life. So when I was 20 years old, I was in a car accident where I was hit by an inebriated driver that killed my twin brother. I was driving the car. I cannot begin to describe you the guilt that this made me feel. And a lot of the resulting, I hate the term mental illness, but I'm going to use it as a shorthand here, mental illness that I still deal with today. And actually, for the better part of a decade, I actually thought I was disfigured because of this accident. Like, I would look in the mirror and see a face that wasn't my face. I suddenly knew what it felt like to be a monster, because I felt like I had killed my best friend. And I needed something to make me get out of my bed every morning. I would not have survived if it wasn't for monsters. And so I took a project that I had been doing as work for hire. It was a concept called Halloween Man. And I had put a lot of myself in it already, but suddenly it took on this very personal thing to me, because it was a character that was about resilience and also about penance deep down, and feeling like you don't fit. And what I really had is looking at this whole lifetime of looking at characters like Frankenstein's monster and the Wolfman and the Creature from the Black Lagoon, and these characters that are just, even though they're destructive in their way, they're longing for something. They want love or the fit in, or, in the case of King Kong, just to be left alone. And I suddenly felt that on a personal level. And I was able to fuel this into this comic, and suddenly making myself get out of bed and not wanting to drill a hole in my head. Suddenly, I had a reason, and I was able to tell a story where the monster, a real monster, away in the characters like the Hulk or the Thing couldn't even be, because he was a character that eats people. I was able to tell a story where the monster was the hero and the monster got the girl, and deep down, we got to see what the soul of this monster was. And that, he might have been, if had fate been a little kinder to him, he might have been gentle. And even though when people read my comic, they tend to think that it's this very, and it is in a way, this very wacky and whimsical thing, and they only see the surface. It was a way for me to sort through my pain. And I can say without a doubt, if it wasn't for a monster, if it wasn't for my love of monsters, I might not be here today. Debbie Downer. So on that note, we could talk at you for the better part of this hour. But when we do our panels, we like them to be kind of a conversation. So I want to see if any of you want to ask us a question. We'll start with her in the front row, but we will try to get to everybody.
So you talked a lot about how you grew up in the 80s and how it was sort of this mecca of classic horror movies. What is y'all's impression of the more modern horror movies that have been coming out within the past few years? Have you guys been a fan of horror, the trends been taking the past few years, or do you feel like it's kind of taking a slump?
I really enjoy this recent trend in kind of like indie horror or art house horror. I was also an early adopter of like, J horror and stuff like that, and K horror. So I love horror in like all its variants. I mean, I guess I probably don't like torture porn very much, but I mean, for the most part, horror that has to do with like really being, freaking scared of something, I'm into it no matter what it is. Even like the weirdest things, things like, if we talk about It Follows or The Babadook and all that, these are like really interesting new monsters that are being created, or the doppelgangers, what are they called? The tethered from Us are really another fantastic creation. So I think that there's like wonderful monsters being created in modern horror, and I love it. And I loved the monsters in the 80s. 90s were a bit of a slump as far as like monsters were concerned, but this new millennium, new century has brought a lot of really cool things. What do you guys feel?
I want to real quickly. A lot of times when people, you mentioned some great new creations that are being created, like It Follows, which I liked, and Us, which I haven't seen yet. But a lot of people talk about, oh well, I can't believe they're doing remakes of this, remakes of that, and I would point out that remakes are not necessarily bad, because they can bring back attention to this earlier film that was made, and B, sometimes the new version can be a great reinvention. I love pointing out that one of the biggest remakes that people ever talk about is The Thing, which is a remake of a movie from the 50s, and it's like 60s, and it's like no one ever talks about that earlier version because the remake was so amazing. And then one of my favorite movies, and it won the Oscar from the past couple of years, is The Shape of Water, which is entirely a remake of The Creature from the Black Lagoon, but told from a different point of view. And to tie back to what Drew was saying earlier, there's always ways to take, these older stories, these monster stories, but if you can tell them from a new angle and tell them from like, maybe the monster's point of view sometimes, it really changes the story. And you can take these older stories and retell them in a way. So that's why I'm not opposed to remakes. I like those ideas too.
Well, I've an interesting relationship with horror movies. Some of them, like I said, I've always been really into. I tend to go for more like haunted house movies, but I love obviously like monsters. I have a personal affection for The Wolfman and the Wolfman remake. We're just speaking of remakes, because this here guy proposed to me at the Alamo Drafthouse premiere of the Wolfman remake. Yeah, it's kind of our thing. And we said we had a very gothic love story. We met at my very first show during South by Southwest with my band at a bar named Headhunters. We had our first date on the South Congress Bat Bridge. We had our first kiss at a skate park named the
Under
Broken
a full
Head.
moon.
Yes, it was. And then, getting engaged during The Wolfman. So I'm not going to talk trash about some of the more modern monster movies, especially because I love The Shape of Water. I love The Creature from the Black Lagoon, and this was just a beautiful rendition of it. But I also really think of some of the movies from my childhood that are, and not just movies, but different. What's the word I'm looking for? With it.
Like literary characters, literary monsters.
Yeah, it's but the original, if you haven't seen it, it was something that I remember watching or trying to let my parents let me watch this when I was in, I think, 3rd or 4th grade when it came on TV, and everyone, it was talking about that in school because it was like a weekly horror special that I think ABC did. And they did that and like the Tommy Knockers. And this was like my first kind of, foray into this new horror. And, all of these things that have come back now are, this throwback feel. I would love to see some more original takes on horror, but I feel like I'm also totally digging the political satire that has come out of horror. Not that hasn't always been there. You think of like Rosemary's Baby, total classic. Not that I'm totally down with the people who made the movie, but the idea of this woman's right, the idea of consent, all of these things being taken away is so relevant even now. And then we have, Jordan Peele's Us. Like, that movie's take on, our racial injustices in the United States is fantastic and, sadly enough, very relevant. So, I feel like we have a really great opportunity here to continue making new things that are going to just, continue to wow people.
I think it's always easy. Look, I love 80s horror. I also always recommend that people go back to like the 30s and 40s and, see vintage horror. But I also think, sometimes you hear the phrase golden age syndrome, where people think of like this time was like the only time where something was good. But there's always good horror movies. There's always good monster movies. Even David was just saying, the 90s, there wasn't anything good during that time period. Well, what about Candyman? That movie is amazing.
Yes. I have to admit, Candyman is an incredible creation.
Yeah, like
Silence of the Lambs.
Not a monster movie, but great horror
right,
movie.
It's not actually a
great horror movie.
but
my point being is there's always, if you're willing to dig or willing to look, there's always something good. I just saw Crawl over the summer, which didn't get as much attention as it should, but it is way better than even that. Easily could have just been like a sci-fi movie of the week. And they actually, by getting good actors and putting a lot of effort into it, made it a movie that was nicely tense and almost Hitchcockian. And it could have just been a splatter movie where alligators eat people, and they made something way better than it needed to be. So you can always find good horror. You can always find interesting monsters. Sometimes it takes a little bit more digging, but I think there's always good stuff. You had something you wanted to add? No? Okay, what was your question?
Okay, and interesting, he actually said just a moment ago, the question about the cold water. Have all of you seen The Shape of Water?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. How do you feel about that take on the monster? Which I think something kind of already gave.
I just want to say one thing about that. I have always loved the visual design of The Creature from the Black Lagoon. And whenever somebody would say they need to stop making remakes, and this is for years I would say this, that was my go-to example of The Creature from the Black Lagoon is probably the best design of a monster until the late 70s, and yet never really been in a good movie. Not in a way that I could really say, yes, definitively a good movie.
Disagree.
I know, I knew you were going to say that. That's why I said I paused on that. I was like, yep, he's going to disagree. But that was always my go-to example of there needed to be a remake of that film because it's such a beautiful design for a creature, and yet there wasn't a lot of meat to those original stories. And Guillermo del Toro came in and just, I think he originally had approached them about making a Creature from Black Lagoon movie, which would have been part of their dark universe, and they were like, no, we want you to make it more Tom Cruise-y kind of a thing. And he's like, I'm going to go make my own movie instead. And I just can't. Just imagine an alternate reality in which their dark universe they tried to start with The Mummy would have started with Shape of Water. That would have been an entirely different, universe. I would have loved to have seen a universe built with that as the foundation. So that's just my take on that.
I absolutely, like I said, I adore the movie. Not that it doesn't have some faults. Everything does, and it gets a little creepy with the bestiality. Let's not, let's not mince words. Yeah. But other than the actual physical aspect of it, the love story itself is still one that's a Beauty and the Beast love story. It's still very classic, and on top of that, having that various viewpoint from not only just a different person other than the people out hunting this monster or even the monster itself, but having it be just this person trying to help the monster, but really, it's a person who has a disability who often feels and is seen like, an outcast from society, and not something that we tend to actually get. We don't have a lot of first-person narratives, and not just in horror, but in generally, like, in the media, coming from not only people with disabilities, but women in particular, and very few are coming from the deaf community. So I feel like that's kind of a really big breakthrough to open that up, and so that's a really great thing to kind of keep in mind as we discuss like the horror movies and the monsters, is that that I keep saying, that satire, that political statement that we can draw from the monsters and use them to compare not only like the trauma in our own lives and the lives of the people around us, but in society and our government.
Yeah, I mean, there's some problems with representation in that film. I mean, there's some good things about it. The creature design is great. The storyline is great. The romance is good. It's not a perfect film, though. I mean, I think that a lot of people, are overwhelmed by like just the gorgeousness of the production and the creature design and stuff like that. But I mean, it has some problems. It's fraught. Some of the ancillary characters are there. They're given short shrift in the screenplay. I don't like the African American characters, the gay character. I mean, they do great work, but I just feel like their story is too much as like the magical helpers of the white woman, and there's some problems with it, but taken as a whole, it's a good film. I enjoyed watching it, and I am able to watch things that I find like slightly problematic without like getting my knickers in a bunch. But I do want to be the one voice on the panel that's like, yeah.
I would like to add, yes, it's a wonderful movie. It's good to watch, but nothing will ever top the original Creature from the Black Lagoon. Jack Arnold rules. Your question, we'll get to you. Your question?
My question was, since some of you guys work in comics or in the horror sphere of that, what did you guys think of the Immortal Hulk?
Despite being the Marvel guy, I didn't start reading it until this past week, so I'm catching up. I had actually, I don't want to say written it off, but I had actually initially ignored it because very often times somebody will come in with a new and dramatically new take of a Marvel character, and I'm not super into it, so I'll wait and get into it. But then I heard so many people talking about it, I said I had to read it. Out of curiosity, have you read Immortal Hulk?
No.
Have you read Immortal Hulk yet?
I have read some of it, and
Okay.
I think it's very atmospheric. It's an interesting take on the Hulk. What I liked about what I have read of it is that it really digs deep into the idea of the Hulk as a metaphor for dissociative identity disorder, was actually a disorder that I have. I concurrently, because of the car accident I mentioned earlier, I concurrently have two entirely different personalities. I'm not going to get into too much detail about that on here, because that's a long story in of itself. But the Hulk, to me, has always had a lot of depth to go into there, and I think other than Peter David, I haven't really seen that explored enough. So, and the artwork is wonderfully, it's got this kind of throwback to EC Comics, and I'm a Jack Kirby fan, so I love the fact that they've gone back to the really sort of Frankensteinian flat-headed Hulk of the 60s era. So there's a lot that I really enjoy about it. I have to say I haven't read all of it, but what I have read I think is stellar.
I wanted to ask you, what do you think about the idea, because the Hulk, especially under Peter David, he was really moving Hulk toward the direction of superhero, right?
Yes.
And now this new Immortal Hulk is really treating it as a horror comic. And what do you think about that idea of Hulk? It's still the same basic stories, Hulk and villains and, whatever, but it's being done through a different lens. Instead of using the lens of superheroes, it's the lens of horror.
I mean, I think you can go either way with the Hulk because it's baked into the character from the get-go. Like, he was created, like, literally Stan Lee was like, I want to, let's make a good werewolf. Let's make a good Mr. Hyde. And so that's kind of, that is the character. I don't think either is wrong. I will say this as somebody that does have a dissociative disorder, and because the Hulk is one of the only few representations of it that's even slightly positive in fiction. I do at times wish that, as much as I'm a Ben Grimm guy, poor Bruce Banner, I just wish the guy would get a break,
Yeah.
So you had a question?
Yes. Besides the Dark Universe for Universal Studios, there's also a YouTuber group called Crypt TV. They're actually building up their own monster universe.
Crypt TV on YouTube.
I am not familiar with that, alas.
Dark universe of like these kinds of public domain monsters. Then, what do you mean? Yeah, more or less.
No, they create their own.
Oh, their own
Okay.
creatures. Okay,
Based on like the original.
got it. But
But
like,
something to look into.
that's a good
definitely
tip.
curious.
they're also on Facebook, and I mean that general idea I think is really good. So I have a short story collection called Chupacabra Vengeance, and in Chupacabra Vengeance I've got stories that are kind of like, like analogs of these things, but like Mexican or Mexican American. So I think it's really fascinating to think about zombies, but from like an Aztec point of view, where they're called the Mixteca, or to think about the werewolf, but from the point of view of the Nahuales, the shapeshifters, right? And to think of vampires, but as I was said in my little intro, from the perspective of these the vampire tradition from the state of Tlaxcala, which is these women have to detach their legs once a month to fly off and drink the blood of the innocent. That particular story is really fascinating. A lot of people don't realize that vampire stories have existed in Mexico for more than 1,000 years, because this is an Aztec tradition. The story basically goes like this. It's really short. When the Mexica are coming out of Aztlan, out of the southwest, into Mexico to eventually, wander around and then and find the eagle on the cactus and all the stuff that a lot of people know about the Mexica and how they how they create an empire. They're led by a god, Huitzilopochtli, the god of war. And first he's in a human form, and then he realizes that he's a god incarnate, and then he takes over. He's got a sister named Malinalxochitl, and Malinalxochitl doesn't want their people to go as far south as he does. They get free of Aztlan and their overlords there, and she's like, let's just settle here in the desert. This is a wonderful place. We can establish ourselves here. And she's against human sacrifice, stuff like that. And so what he does is he gets really upset with her, and he puts her and her followers to sleep. But right before he does it, he tells her, you're always belittling my ambitions for our people and the human sacrifice that I believe in or whatever. So I'm cursing you and your followers. You will, as much as you hate the spilling of human blood, you will now have to partake of human blood. And he basically turns his sister and all of her followers into vampires, into the Tlahuelpuchi. It's a fascinating thing. And this is a lot of people don't know about it, because a lot of people, as we were talking about before the panel, don't even know anything about Aztec or Mayan mythology at all. They can name every single Greek and Roman and Norse god, but you ask them, name one Aztec god, and they're like, what? The Aztecs had gods? So this is really fascinating, and that's the kind of stuff that I like to do. I mean, in our previous panel we talked about public domain creatures, but I really love the idea of there are analogs to these types of monsters in multiple cultures, and I'd really like to see us doing more of that, exploring that. Our friend Jason Henderson has a trilogy of middle grade books, the Alex Van Helsing series, and in them there are these different types of vampires that they're fighting, and some of them are South American vampires and all this. This is really, really great stuff. I love to see that. I love to see these new cultural and ethnic twists on things.
We need diversity in monsters.
Yes, definitely. First, monster diversity.
Actually, they branch out. They don't know So it's just like all around the world.
Okay, so they're doing something along.
What's the name of it again?
Crypt
TV.
TV.
Look into that.
Cool.
All right.
I will check it out.
I want to real quickly branch off what you were saying a second ago. Could you define for the audience real quick kukui or koko?
Oh yeah. Have you ever heard the word kukui before? So like the kukui or koko or kuku is like a monster that goes all the way back to the Spanish, and it's really interesting because if you think about the word for coconut in Spanish, it's coco, but it didn't come first. The term for the monster came first because the coco in Spanish tradition, and there's this famous painting by Goya. I don't know if you've ever seen it. Porque viene el cuco. Have you ever seen this?
I'm not sure that.
It's
I know Goya, but I don't know.
Yeah,
that
but
one
you just like totally Google it and it will like freak you out. So it's like some kind of boogeyman who's like kind of formless. He wears like a shapeless robe, and when you see his face, it's like just featureless. There's just like a mouth, and just like the rest is like featureless. And the idea is that. The original idea is that there's this creature that comes out at night, and if you're a child and you're not asleep, it will come and take you. Sleep protects you. Sleep is like a barrier against the coco or the kukui.
A sort of reverse Freddy Krueger.
A reverse Freddy Krueger. Go to sleep and he doesn't mess with you, right? But it's come to be a generic term for like any kind of monster at all. So
Don't listen to your parents. Kukui's going to get you.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, definitely it's one of those things. If you disobey your parents, there's a kukui. And so like now you imagine there's all these different types of boogeymen of different shapes and sizes. My friend Javier Garza has a great children's book called it's something and creepy and other creepy kukuis. I can't remember what the main title is, and it's just a book of all these different monsters.
I know that book. I can't think of the title either, but I know that book.
Well, you've probably seen it. It's like in English and Spanish. He's a great illustrator.
The reason I want to bring that up, though, is because I have a confession to make. I am the kukui. To explain, I used to work at Hollywood Video back long in the days when people would find their movies at stores. I used to work at Hollywood
Video.
I know.
Not even Blockbuster.
Not even Blockbuster.
That's so sad.
So I went to
Sorry,
Hollywood Video, and there was this little girl who was going by and picking up candy. She'd open it up, take a bite, and throw it on the floor, pick it up, open it up, take a bite, throw it on the floor. And I was walking behind her, and I'd pick it up, and I had my little vest there, and I'd be collecting all these candies. So she gets to her mom, and I told as her mom was getting to the checkout, and I said, ma'am, would you like to buy these? And she doesn't look at me. She doesn't respond to me. She looks at the little girl, and she says, you better stop that, or Kukui's going to get you. And she points at me. And the little girl, just all these years, in her like 4 or 5 years of life, have been hearing about Kukui getting her, and there he is.
Fine. He's
and
dumb.
she has this look of terror in her
He works
face.
at the Hollywood Video.
And the thing is, we all know that mothers never lie. So because of that, that is how I found out that I am Kukui.
Yeah, mother.
So would you say you became a monster because you were being paid minimum wage?
Well, for all I know, I always had been this monster, and I just found out through a minimum wage job.
It brought out the monster in you. That's what it
Sorry, that's a little side story. We got jumped off way. That's not even
was.
what you were asking about.
That was cute. That was cute. Yeah.
So did anybody?
Other questions up here in front?
To like go off what you guys were saying earlier, how do you guys feel about like representation in horror? Since like a lot of horror stuff like kind of has like minorities as the bad guys. Like for example, in Sleepaway Camp, the twist at the end.
Oh man.
And then like in more recent stuff like Split, like the guy had like DID and like his head went way over like 23.
Yeah.
Also bringing a lot of gender identity with that one.
Yeah, now horror has a very, like it has a bad history with representation, which is why we need more horror by people of color, by disabled creators, by queer creators. That's the only way to change this, is you have to bring in people who are able to tell those stories with good representation, which is not to say that you can't have, white male creators having good representation. Clearly that can happen, but it's like less likely to happen. And there's just not enough diversity in horror. So it's one of the reasons that I just welcome all these, this surge in like female and people of color and queer creators of horror. But yeah, I mean, it's definitely very problematic until like recent years was very little. The whole final girl thing may feel to some men like it's like hey, I'm being feminist or whatever, but it's kind of in a condescending way. Yeah, so yeah.
It's terribly condescending.
Yep.
Like it's not only not feminist because it's not respecting all women. It's
Right.
respecting this one woman who lives up to an ideal
Yeah.
that we have. Everyone else is just cut out. So the girl who decides to smoke some weed, she's out.
She dies.
The girl who
Has
has
sex.
sex.
Yeah.
And usually, if you noticed, she tends to be even pressured into it. It's not always that she's even willing, but then, someone comes in the back seat of the car, and then they get murdered.
Yep.
So it's one of those things that I feel like not just in horror in like our movies too. It's everywhere, and like our stories. Think about what the Banshee represents. This old woman and who loses. It's usually like someone who's lost a child, and it's like we are vilifying a mother who's lost their child and is grieving terribly.
The same
And
thing with the
we've made
Llorona.
her into the monster. And Drew was the same. I have a song that I've been working on about Medusa. The thing about Medusa, everyone's always thinks of her as like, oh, the Gorgon who turns men into stone just when they look at her into her eyes. And really, Medusa's a rape victim. Medusa was raped by Zeus in Athena's temple and then ostracized by everyone. And that was a curse in itself. And then, she's brought to be this monster, not just by like this, physical abnormality that's become of her, but this, like I said, ostracization. It's something that I think we could definitely use more of in horror, but also in all types of media, having that type of representation from, people of color, people who are of different religions and, genders or gender identities and, people who have a different sexual preference. It's all valuable and it's all necessary in order for us to have like this brilliant, colorful world, because we're just missing out right now.
There was another question on the back, wasn't there?
I would like to weigh in on this real quick.
I apologize. Jumping all
The
over
problem
you.
I have a lot with representation in the horror genre is as somebody that it has a mental illness is that I'm always seeing myself portrayed as the villain.
Yeah.
Like I think of like, and it's problem. The thing is often there's problematic works that like they're upsetting to me on one level, but I have to acknowledge they're wonderful pieces of art. Like Psycho. Like Psycho is a very poor understanding of what having a dissociative disorder is like. But Alfred Hitchcock was a genius, and that movie is wonderful. So I have this very strong reaction to it going both ways. Like I would never.
It's also very transphobic.
Yeah.
Yes, it is very transphobic, and you just brought up Sleepaway Camp, which could also be thought of as transphobic, and continuing down the through line of mental illness, like. I was asked by a friend of mine who knows I have a dissociative disorder, is like, could you tell me, I want you to see Split, I think you would like it. Go see Split, I think you would like it. So finally I broke down and I watched it, and James McAvoy is an amazing actor, and it's a great performance. And that movie still broke my heart, because it's, again, like, why am I always the villain? Why am I a serial killer?
It's always violent.
And, even though, again, I have to acknowledge, as a performance, James McAvoy must be lauded. He does an amazing job in that film. And I think M. Night Shyamalan tried to actually put in real psychology. I think there was like an attempt, better than a lot of things I see, but it's still, it's pop psychology.
He didn't do that with the Mark Wahlberg movie
No.
with the trees.
So 10 minutes? Okay.
Spoiler.
I wanted to ask on the idea of representation on the opposite end, though. What do you think of Rocky Horror? Because here you have Frankfurter, who is presented as, gender nonconforming, and then initially seems to be the bad guy, but as the story goes on, he's actually the hero of the story and really opens everybody's eyes to these new ideas. Is that an example of, and again, I may be the wrong person to say this because I'm Hispanic, but I'm the straight white guy up here. So is that a good example of
Representation?
That's a complicated question, is what that is.
It is. That's why I'm asking. That's why I don't know.
That's another, like, one of those
Yeah.
fraught films, right? Yeah.
I'd say the best people to ask are the people that are potentially being portrayed. So, I mean, does the queer community respond well to Rocky Horror? You know it.
Yep.
We love Rocky Horror. But, you know, there are people who do have issues with it. You know, and it's not just with the character of Dr. Frankenfurter, but, you know, Magenta and Columbia get some trash because of their relationships, and the way that they're kind of like dominated by men, and it's just one of those things like where it tends, exactly. It's also trial and error. Nothing is going to be perfect, and as much as we want to have all of these wonderful points of view to make this like a better form of entertainment and just art, it's not always going to be like everything to everyone. That's impossible, you know, and, you know, but making strides, making it, you know, where one person feels more accepted, more like seen, is a huge success in my book, you know. And will they be able to get everyone down on one shot? Probably not. It'll be great when that movie comes out. I'm looking forward to seeing it. But
So we've just been given that we're nearing the end, but we did have one more question in the back.
Gonna ask 2 questions, but I'll just
Two questions? We can probably hammer them out.
try
and, yeah.
First, I'm an 80s kid, so most of my comic book experience comes post-crisis. 1970s, with the relaxation of comic books code, how was it to actually get to see the horror comics and the birth of such titles as Ghost Rider and everything like that? And what's your take during the 90s of the horror genre being brought into the world of role-playing games through the World of Darkness and the Vampire the Masquerade?
Great question.
Well, I was going to say,
You should start with that,
This
yeah.
is my alley here. For those of you guys who are not familiar, comic books were banned from the 50s through the 70s from even mentioning anything like vampires, zombies, undead, also drug references, also sexual references. So as a result, Marvel had a couple like try to sneak in through the back door kind of characters. Morbius, the living vampire, is a Spider-Man bad guy, but the reason he's called the living vampire was because they literally were not allowed to have an undead character. In the rules, it said you cannot have undead characters in your books. So Marvel said, no, he's a living vampire. And so they snuck him in. So as soon as those codes got relaxed in the 70s, Marvel just went all in.
Yeah.
They literally have a superhero whose superhero name is the Son of Satan. And his origin is, guess what? He's the Son of Satan.
It was an amazing time to be a comic book reader. I would just say that.
And the best part about the Son of Satan, Marvel has a character who is a ripoff of Archie, right? And the ripoff of Betty was the main character of that. And she married the son of Satan. So just imagine Betty from Archie marries the son of Satan. That's Marvel history there. Yeah. I'm trying to run through this fast because there's fun stuff with this. Marvel's first ever anime is The Tomb of Dracula. Toei, the people who later made Power Rangers and stuff like that, had a deal with Marvel, and they made an anime movie that was literally an adaptation of Marvel's Tomb of Dracula series. So it's not a great movie, but it's Marvel's first anime, so that's fun. In the 90s, Marvel took these characters and said, and it wasn't just Marvel, DC was doing this too. In the late 80s and 90s, as comics were going to this darker area, and said, let's make these guys the stars of these comics. So that's when Swamp Thing really, really took off as a serious take on superhero monsters. And then Marvel tried this as well in the 90s with bringing back Blade. And I was telling these guys earlier that the Doctor Strange has a bad guy called Nightmare, who is the lord of evil dreams, and they tried to make him this goth pretty boy hero for a very, I know, I'm not kidding, very brief time in the mid 90s. Nightmare had his own series where he was, they tried to do that with him, and just the idea of turning this this pale skinned guy that's obsessed with evil dreams and making him your romantic lead, kind of ahead of its time, It sounds great now. That's what I was saying. They need to bring back that concept of Nightmare now, because he's been just back to being a generic bad guy again for the past 20 years. But I'm like, now is the right time to have this, pale-skinned, scrawny guy who is, Yeah, they were totally trying to rip off Sandman, entirely, like unapologetically trying to rip off Sandman. But where Sandman was this aloof guy in the background who was like watching your dreams happen, Nightmare was the main character of his comic. So it wasn't, a hit, obviously, because most people don't even realize that comic happened. But it was a good idea. And then for World of Darkness, I am a big fan of that. But I think I probably used it wrong, because where it was written to be, put yourself in this gothic setting, my friends and I took that gothic setting and just said, let's tell superhero stories with it. And when the new World of Darkness came out, I was talking to somebody earlier, a lot of people didn't like it, but I loved it because it was basically what I was already doing with my own homebrew games. So it's like they literally, stole ideas from my head and said, "Here's our new edition." So, sorry.
I am not somebody that I was born in 1978, so I'm not somebody that got to read those comics when they were new. But I rode up on my bike every day, like one of the kids on Stranger Things, to our local library. My libraries had these big, thick bound versions of like Tomb of Dracula, Werewolf by Night, Ghost Rider, and I love those characters. I think they are phenomenal. Also, true story, around the same time, Marvel put out a Godzilla comic book, and Godzilla fought both the Avengers and the Fantastic Four. Heck yeah.
Even more true story, Godzilla is still technically part of the Marvel Universe, but not legally so. They lost the rights to call him Godzilla, but they had characters that were introduced in the story. One of them was this biologist that messed with monsters. So literally, there's an Avengers comic where the bad guy from Godzilla shows up and says, my greatest enemy, I have mutated him. And they never once say his name, but it's Godzilla. So the Avengers have fought non-copyright Godzilla. They just could never call him by name. They would just refer to him as the greatest enemy of this bad guy's monster. So. Yeah, Transformers were also part of the Marvel Universe as well, and there's a few characters.
And Doctor Who.
And Doctor Who. Death's Head is a great Marvel character. He was the height of the Transformers, but nowadays in comics he's the height of regular heroes, and it's because of the Doctor. The Doctor actually tricked him to going into the TARDIS, changed the TARDIS size, and then kicked him out. So literally the Doctor, and this is in canon, we cannot, and as one of the guys that does the histories, I cannot say the Doctor did this, but I can say a time-traveling alien using his dimension-shifting device change the height of Death's Head. So it's all part of canon.
So does anybody, routing this back to monsters, before we wrap it up, does anybody have any final thoughts
I feel like
on
I'm
monsters?
dominating this too much. What do you guys think?
Huh? You think you're opting out?
I feel like I was talking too much in the past.
Yeah.
No, I mean, I just think that this is a really rich time. Monsters help us to grapple with insecurities, with worries, with
nightmares.
Nightmares, with our own sense of disaffection and so forth. In a world where like the real monsters and villains are not monstrous, they don't necessarily have mental illnesses or any of these things. They're just apparently very normal people who are evil and hurting common folk. It's sometimes comforting to move into a universe where monsters are monstrous and obvious and can be fought against or reasoned with in some way. Because in the real world, it's not quite that easy, and I think that's one of the appeals of monsters. It's just a way of visualizing the bad things in our lives in a way that can be grappled with, even though with great difficulty. Because in reality, like, what do you do against the real monsters of the world, right?
And that suspense, I have to say, is one of those things that I think so many of us crave in life. It's not, the kind of suspense where you're like, oh God, what are we going to hear on the news next?
Yeah,
we don't want
it's a different
that
type of
kind of suspense. But I think going to the movie theater and, we just saw Scary Movies to Tell in the Dark this past weekend, and fantastic. It was great. The creature designs, and sorry, jump back real quick. That was one big difference from everything else, in my opinion. Like, the creature designs from the 80s to the 90s got like amazing. Like, think about Aliens and Predators and all that jazz. Or aliens. Anyways, going back to what we were just saying. I think it's great. Oh, I'm losing my train of thought.
It's an escape.
Thank you. Yes,
Yeah,
it is an escape. Like we were
yeah.
saying, it was cathartic to be able to see them. But in a way, I think a lot of it is just that excitement to do something. And in a way, they bring us together. I mean, think about, no one wants to go to the horror movie alone usually. Well, not to say you can't. All the more power to you. But that's like the brave individual in my book. I want to go with like a group of friends or Drew and be like, or like, this is gonna happen. I want that like emotional tie-in to it, and not even if I'm not necessarily putting myself in the movie, but in a way, like I feel like I've got my team, and together, like it just makes us feel like we can combat anything, and hopefully not everybody in the movie dies, because that does happen more often than not. Yeah. But you feel when in life that kind of happens, and we are the hero in our own story, and if you live long enough, everyone is going to die. So it's kind of a way to just be relevant in that notion.
So that wraps up our discussion of monsters. Again, we are doing a live podcast at 8 o'clock tonight. However, if you want to come visit with us prior to that, we are at table N3 in the Bazaar. Thank you. You've been a wonderful audience and with wonderful questions. We loved talking with you.